Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Insook Lee, and I'm professor of pastoral care and counseling and the director of a Master of Arts in Pastoral Care and Counseling at New York Theological Seminary. In this webinar, we are going to discuss trauma and healing. We are currently living in a highly stressful environment of COVID-19, which is prone to developing trauma for many of us. If we understand how trauma develops and how it can be taken care of, we may feel a little less anxious, frightened, or out of control. We have a guest, Chaplain Holly Bonner. She is an award-winning mental health professional and the professor, writer, poet, and the creator of Blind Motherhood. She holds a master's in social work from Columbia University, a master's in public administration from Metropolitan College of New York, and a master's in pastoral care and counseling from New York Theological Seminary. She is currently a candidate for her doctorate in ministry at NYTS. And in April 2019, Mayor Bill de Blasio appointed her as a commissioner for a civic engagement representing Staten Island. To welcome Chaplain Bonner.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Lee. It's good to be here with you today.
Good to see you. The first part of our webinar will be my presentation about the understanding of trauma in general. In the second part, Chaplain Bonner will share her experience of working with people in specific pandemic and some other situations. So I'm going to show you a PowerPoint. We cannot assume that all people who experienced certain traumatic events as traumatized, such as combat, abuse, disasters, or pandemic. Some people are able to integrate their experiences without developing trauma, PTSD. Then what is trauma? It is our internal response to the external events. The next slide. There is a threat perceived. Then the actual or perceived threat activates our inbuilt autonomous nervous system for survival. And our fight or flight response is mobilized. That means that we need to do something using our body, like fighting against or running away from the danger. This response is mostly automatic. However, if the fight or flight response of the survival does not resolve or mitigate the threat, and if the fear state continues without action, two things can happen. The next slide. The first is a freeze in high anxiety and terror. This is a feeling of paralysis. This is a state of hyperarousal, a chronic anxiety coupled with immobility. The second is shut down or dissociate. Awareness is shut down, and we may no longer even register physical and emotional pain. We dissociate, feeling emotionally deadened. This is a state of hypoarousal. We just disappear. Trauma develops from this chronic feeling of either freeze or shut down. This feeling of immobilization is at the root of most traumas, like there's nothing I can do, no way to escape. One of the characteristics of trauma is that they often live under a feeling of a chronic perceived threat. Even when there's no longer a threat, even though the danger is now in the past. the memories are still stored in us as bodily and emotional sensations. As a result, our brain structure slowly changes, and we may lose touch with ourselves and surroundings. Our cognition and perception could be distorted or damaged, and a fragmented sense of self is born. The next slide. Alienation from ourself. Dissociation is the essence of trauma. We human beings need psychological safety from overwhelming events to survive. The sense of self must be kept safe and separate from the ongoing trauma. Often, our overwhelming traumatic experience is split off, fragmented, and disowned. And disowning the wounded part, for example, the child part who endured the abuse and the humiliation, is a survival response that keeps them safe from the painful events. As life goes on, the healthy part of the child is free to develop normally, while the other part of the child bears all the emotional and physical imprint of the past, and split is taking place. As a consequence, they often develop shame, self-doubt, or self-loathing, which is the internal attacks on self-esteem towards the disowned part of self. This alienation interferes with self-acceptance and self-forgiveness that we need in life. Resolution of painful past experiences cannot truly be achieved without reclaiming the lost child or disowned parts of ourselves, extending to them a helping hand, the welcoming them home, creating safety for them, and making them feel acknowledged, wanted, needed, and valued. The next slide. Our trauma is pre-verbal. Unprocessed sense of fragments of trauma, like sounds, smells, and physical sensations, are registered separately from the narrative itself. Their bodies re-experience terror, rage, and helplessness. But these feelings are almost impossible to articulate using our left brain. Flashbacks. One of the symptoms of trauma is a past incident, the recurring vividly in the present mind. During flashbacks, traumatized people's brain lit up only on the right side, not on the left side that is in charge of language and rational thinking. Trauma is primarily remembered not as a story that has a beginning, middle, and end, but remembered as fragmented sensory imprints, like physical sensations accompanied by intense emotions like terror, anxiety, and helplessness. Traumatic experience is remembered somatically. This is where a bottom-up approach to therapy becomes essential, in contrast to a top-down traditional insight-oriented talk therapy. The aim of a bottom-up approach is to change our physiology, our relationship to our body. Many people with histories of trauma experience the extreme disconnection from their bodily sensations. The next slide. Traumatized people feel stuck in the past and feel alone without getting any help from outside, a feeling of isolation. As they have not integrated their past experience into the ongoing stream of their present life, they continue to be there in the past and cannot be fully alive in the present. They are stuck in the past, in the sense that they remain at the level of adaptation that they developed in the past and actually was necessary to survive and to protect themselves at that time. But they no longer need that high level of sensitivity and vigilance in the present. Next slide. Many people talk about some stages of healing. The first is self-regulation. And the second, address the traumatic material itself. Third, integration of fragmented memories. Then people will no longer suffer from the symptoms of trauma or PTSD. Next slide. The first, self-regulation. Often we call it relaxation. They have to learn to self-regulate the symptoms before they begin the work of exposure to traumatic memories. And psychosomatic therapist Pat Ogden talks about the window of tolerance. Self-regulation is the ability to manage our emotions and behavior and to resist highly emotional reactions to upsetting stimuli, to calm ourselves down when we get upset, and to handle frustration without an outburst. We can function best within our window of tolerance. But a traumatic experience can lead us to go outside the window of tolerance to the states of either hyperarousal or hypoarousal. Hyperarousal refers to freeze in high anxiety, and hypoarousal means shut down or dissociate. Self-regulation is the first step in healing, befriending the sensations in our bodies. For most people, intentional body relaxation requires training, such as relaxation skills, exercise, martial arts, yoga, meditation, mindfulness, and other techniques. Next slide. The next step is to revisit and address traumatic material of the past. There are many different techniques. In order to metabolize, not just superficially verbalize traumatic memories, they may use mind-body therapies such as psychosomatic therapy or EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. But visiting the past should be done while people are firmly rooted in the present and feeling as calm, safe, and grounded as possible. This is why self-regulation is so important. Therapy won't work as long as people keep being pulled back into the into the past and re-traumatized. Being grounded in the present while visiting the trauma material opens the possibility of realizing that the terrible events now belong to the past. Next slide. The finally, integration of fragmented memories. Now they are fully connected with all parts of themselves and their life experiences. They can be fully in the present. Now they are able to articulate a verbal narrative about what happened to them and what it means to them, and trying to make sense of the traumatic experience by creating meanings. At this stage, a verbal narrative activates the function of our frontal lobes of the brain, which is in charge of understanding and making a coherent story. This part of the brain has been often shut down in relation to the traumatic event. Integration would present as an acceptance of the event, but without getting caught in a cycle of feeling like a victim who constantly relives it. This is the end of my PowerPoint presentation. So far, we've briefly discussed what is trauma and how it develops. Good news is that trauma can be successfully treated and can be prevented in many cases because trauma develops as our internal response to the external events. The COVID-19 situation is very prone to the development of trauma for many of us, in the sense of isolation, lack of predictability, loss of safety, immobility, and no sense of control. All of these are the major characteristics that can lead to trauma. Currently, stress and trauma affects in widespread depression, anxiety, addiction, and suicide, as well as domestic and interpersonal violence. We are at great risk of getting into very destructive behaviors, like easily getting angry, upset, losing our temper, and committing potentially violent acts. Actually, we have some data about the issues of domestic violence sharply increased in many countries, like Spain, France, China, and in the United States. And another concern is that individuals with histories of trauma face an additional challenge because the COVID-19 situation can trigger their painful, painful memories of traumatic experience of the past, increasing the sense of loneliness, helplessness, and isolation, triggering the disowned parts of self. So with all this in mind, now I'd like to turn to Chaplain Bonner. And Chaplain Bonner, can you illustrate trauma through both personal lens and through your work of chaplaincy? And do you like to start with your personal experience?
Yes, I'll start with my personal experience. COVID-19 has been particularly difficult for my family. I am the wife of a first responder. My husband had a 25-year career with the New York City Police Department, and COVID-19 has hit the police department, as you know, quite hard. So in the beginning of the COVID pandemic back in March, he was able to see how unprepared much of the city was in dealing with this pandemic. And my husband works the midnight shift, or did work the midnight shift before retirement. And when he would go into his station, into his precinct, he was noticing more and more people were getting ill. So we had a conversation at home about what would happen if he came in contact with somebody that he was helping in his role as a detective, to him and to our family. We discussed the possibility of him going into work, and if he had been exposed, not coming home. And I felt mentally I was prepared for that. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. He was not exposed to somebody in the field. He was exposed to a coworker who actually had a family member that had been exposed to COVID, and my husband had worked very closely with that individual. And it was that prompted him to decide to leave the home. So one night in March, when we had heard the news that this coworker had the family member who had become sick with COVID, he said that he really needed to leave the house. And it was a very sudden decision, something that I did not anticipate happening the way that it did. And within the span of 4 hours, we had to have him packed, find him a place to live, and he would not return to the home for 6 months after leaving in March. So I was alone by myself in the home with two small children, ages 6 and 7. I myself have always suffered with anxiety, and my husband is a great calming effect for me. Over the course of our marriage and the span of our time together, he really is a kind of a pillar of stability for myself. So the fact that he was leaving and leaving so suddenly was very traumatizing, and I could feel the anxiety starting to bubble up inside of me, knowing that this was going to happen. But I also knew that I had two small children that I had to take care of, and I had to figure out how I was going to do that in order to keep life as normal as possible for them in these very uncertain times.
And wow, I really can't imagine how difficult situation that your family had to deal with. You said you have two children, small children. Please tell us how your children reacted to their father being out of home. And when your husband returned home, how did you find he coped with the trauma as being a first responder?
It was very, very difficult for my children. As I mentioned, they are quite young. My daughter just turned 6, and my oldest daughter is 7. So, for them developmentally, not having their father at home when they were so used to being in his presence every day was very, very shocking for them. They were also smart enough to realize some of the things that they were hearing on television and media about the coronavirus, and they were fearful of it. It was difficult for them to hear these things and worry about daddy potentially getting sick. Um, One of the things that my husband and I did do to try to lessen the trauma for them is that every day he would come to the house at breakfast time, and he would come to the house at dinner time, and I would prepare his meals for him. I would wash his laundry for him. So he would see the children and myself, but he'd be on the sidewalk from our front stairs. So he was not able to touch them, hug them. A lot of times it was kind of, shouting almost back and forth, even so that he could hear us over the traffic. Sometimes in the evenings, we would go for walks and he would trail behind, safely socially distancing. But it was not the same for the girls or for our daughters. It was very, very difficult. With my oldest daughter, she's always been more practical and kind of pragmatic in some ways. So she understood that daddy had a job to do, and we knew that my husband did have a retirement date at the end of June. So there was an end time for their father to return. So what I did with her was we really focused on the counting, counting the days until daddy would come home. And I think that that gave her some comfort in knowing that this was a short-term experience for her. For my youngest, she really started to act out quite a bit, a lot of tantrums, things that I had never experienced before with her. Even when she was 2 and 3 years old, she did not act out the way she did without her father at home. I know she missed him desperately. I know she felt unsafe. Both of them wanted to sleep in the bed with me at night. And that's not something that my husband and I typically allow unless the children are unwell, or they're not feeling good. But I really gave into that, and I allowed them to sleep with me. And they slept with me every night, all three of us in the bed until my husband arrived back home in July. And I think that that helped with their trauma because it did give them a sense of safety. I think so often children are very afraid of the dark, and bad things happen at night. So for them to have those 8 or 9 hours where they were getting a good night's sleep with mommy in bed, it definitely did help them. And it also gave them the opportunity to rest. So the next day when they would wake up, they weren't as cranky. They weren't as easily frustrated. And that's really how we kind of worked through until my husband arrived home in July. Now, I will say, when he returned home, I found his reactions to the house and to the family quite shocking. I really had not seen him react the way that he did since 9/11. And my husband was a first responder in 9/11 as well. But when he first entered the house, he looked around like he had never seen it before. And watching his head turn as he had looked at this place where we had built this life together, it really let me know that he had experienced a very large trauma, both in his work and in his personal life. And then he shared with me how afraid that he was. And, my husband is 6'6", a very big, strong man, always has been a very physically and mentally strong. And he expressed to me that COVID was just so uncertain and so many people were getting ill that he really was fearful that he might catch the virus, while at work. And he said the only thing that really helped him kind of get through that period was that he knew if God forbid something had happened to him, that we had put things in place that I would be okay with the girls financially. We would have been able to keep our home. I would have had health insurance. I would have had help from his family, both with raising the children and in any other way that I may have potentially needed help. So that was something that kind of gave him some peace of mind, I think. But that really did shock me, that he felt like that was a possibility. He never indicated that to me during any point when he was away. And in some ways, I'm glad he didn't, because I think that would have made my anxiety go higher than it already was. And it would have deviated some of my attention from what I needed to do with the children. And I would have been focused more on worrying about him.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing your personal and your family's experience. And now, as a chaplain, please tell us how you helped to mitigate trauma among other people in your community.
So where I live in Staten Island, we actually have a home that shares property with a Catholic cemetery. It's one of the largest Catholic cemeteries in the borough. And during the height of COVID here on the island, from the end of March about until mid-April, we had countless deaths that were occurring, on a daily basis. Typically, when somebody dies, especially in the Catholic faith, you would either have a priest or a deacon come and perform the service. They call it a rite of committal. It's a burial prayer that they will do before the body is entombed into the ground. And because so many people were dying at such a rapid pace, they did not have the ability to have these clergy members come out and perform these services. The other thing that was inhibiting it was many of the clergy that were not ill fell into that very vulnerable age range where they were senior citizens between the ages of 60 and 80 plus. So they were not feeling confident themselves to kind of venture out and perform these services as well. And when you think back to what it was like here in New York during that time, you really can't blame them. So I had been contacted by a local funeral home and also the cemetery itself. They knew that I was a chaplain. They also knew the circumstances that my husband was out of the home, and they asked if I would be willing to perform the services. Now, I myself, being the only parent in the home, I did not want to get too close to anybody that was attending the service. My backyard shares a plot of land with the cemetery that I can see their parking lot. So I would stand on my back deck, perform the service with the person that was there for the deceased in the parking lot next to the hearse or next to the casket, depending on what the family chose. Very often, there was only one person in attendance because of COVID regulations, as well as the funeral director. And that one person was quite often a child of the deceased. I conducted 19 total burials, and of those 19, they were all senior citizens between the ages of 70 and above. And I will tell you that the relief that these people felt by me being able to do this service for them was definitely something that gave them comfort in their trauma. But I was very cognizant in doing these services to remember what I was going through. And I had to try to compartmentalize my feelings. I had to leave what was going on in the home. And when I exited the door, I had to be focused on what could I do to mitigate the trauma of this family who just lost their loved one, quite possibly in a nursing home or hospital facility where they were not able to say goodbye. There was no closure for them. So their trauma was also exceedingly high. Thankfully, I was able to do that for the community, on a personal level. And in one of my other roles as a chaplain, I chaplain with New York State Chaplain Task Force. We have something that's called a compassion line, and it's a 24/7 hotline where people can call in if they need chaplaincy services. Maybe they're going through a difficult time, maybe they're fearful about COVID. Sometimes we get calls about what's going on even in the election process. People often think that when somebody reaches out for a chaplain, it's only in instances of sickness or illness. And that really is not the case. People reach out for chaplaincy for a myriad of reasons. The real caveat to what we do is that we're giving perspective from the spiritual lens. That's really the goal of a chaplain, and the work that we do. So during COVID, aside from doing these burials, we did have calls that I would take from the compassion line. And a lot of people that were calling in were experiencing trauma. Many of them were dealing with COVID isolation. They just felt very, very alone and wanted to speak to somebody. These people were cut off from their congregations. They had no spiritual care or support from their, weekly service that they would normally attend. A lot of the seniors had difficulty with technology. Picking up a phone to make a phone call to a chaplain was far more easier for them than logging on to Zoom or Google Hangouts or Google Meets in order to do something virtually. I think for most of the people that I encountered during that time, it really was helping them navigate the isolation part of the trauma of COVID-19 and letting them know that there was another human being on the other end of the line that cared about them and wanted to help them mitigate the trauma they were experiencing.
Yeah, that is the amazing ministry. I really appreciate what you're doing. And I think it must have been very, very difficult, hard for you. You have to deal with your own anxiety and you have to take care of your family and also the function you help as a chaplain to help other people.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it was very difficult.
Yeah. Do you want to say something more about that?
Again, it really was about, the compartmentalizing of what had to be done when. So often with trauma, if you let it overwhelm you, if I had let that anxiety that was bubbling up get the better of me, I would not have been able to function in any of the roles that we talked about: wife, mother, chaplain. It just would not have happened. So being able to be cognizant of that and be aware of it was what really helped me get through those few months.
Okay. Thank you very much. And my last question for you is, the trauma involves a feeling of paralysis, like there's nothing much we can do. In face of stress, our body produces stress hormones, generating energies for fight or flight, as I said in my presentation. But because of social distancing, we don't have enough channels to consume the stress hormone energies. Can you share some resources that we can use for this purpose, like a stress management or self-regulation?
Oh yes, I mean there's so many great virtual tools that you could use. I always recommend to people visit a virtual museum. The Google Arts and Culture website have so many beautiful places that you could visit virtually, and you could absolutely take advantage of that. Take comfort in an ebook. You don't have to worry about going to the library or running to the store to purchase a book. You'd be surprised on how many wonderful books that can help you can find online, whether it's a genre that you enjoy reading or something about mindfulness and spirituality that will also add to calming. You can embrace nature through, taking virtual tours through national parks. A lot of people find a very much a large amount of comfort through nature and experiencing the outdoors. But for some of us, it's not in our backyard, especially if we're living in an apartment or a small space. So the Hidden Worlds of National Parks is one of my favorite websites to visit. It allows me to go in and see some of the parks that I'll never maybe physically be able to visit because of the distance, but I can visit them right in my own home. I would also recommend exercise classes that are online. As you mentioned, Physical health is so important when you're dealing with trauma. Take an online exercise class. There's so many of them that are for free at your local YMCAs, or even some online studios. And then I love guided meditation practices and mindfulness. I use an app called Calm, and it works with you step by step to help you develop deep breathing skills. And just having those breathing exercises and the sounds that allow you to kind of tune out the world and focus on your breathing and your inner being, that is very, very helpful with trauma. And finally, I would say, if you can connect to a congregation through video or social media, there is no reason that you should go without having some spiritual connection to your faith-based community. And so many of them are online. And if there's not something in your local area, the good thing about online is you can go anywhere in the world and you can connect with a spiritual community that can give you support through your trauma.
Yeah, that is excellent, excellent resources. If you want to add anything else, please do.
Those are the ones that I really go to myself and have found helpful during this time. But, also look locally. A lot of local newspapers, local websites, informational groups on social media will provide lists of places that are offering free resources or free activities. And these activities aren't just for adults. I think that's very, very key to remember. There are so many of these things that I did also with my children, and they loved doing the virtual parks and the virtual museums, the ebooks, because we couldn't get to the library like we normally would. All these things could really be used with any age group. And I think that's very important to know.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I myself use the mindfulness, the Zen style meditation. That really, really helps for self-regulation. So
Absolutely.
I know you do the same thing every morning.
Yes.
Right?
I do. And before bed, I try to get in bed and I do the same thing as well.
Yeah, clear up all the anxiety and then have a good sleep.
Yes.
Other chaplain, thank you so very much, for being with us. And I hope that your ministry will continue to be blessed and fruitful. And
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you all audience for attending this webinar with us today. I hope you stay safe and healthy.